Okay, so I apologize in advance for everyone who's already heard this speech. There's some new stuff in it, so maybe you'll learn some more stuff. But I did my research presentation on the water crisis in Kanpur, India. So to begin with, here's a little map. Right here, the blue river is the Ganges River, and I went ahead and circled Kanpur for you guys so that you can see it sits right on the Ganges River. And there's other rivers too that it sits on, but the main one is the Ganges. Alright, so Kanpur is a highly industrialized city in India. The residents of Kanpur rely heavily on the Ganges River and groundwater for their source of water. They use hand pumps to collect fresh water for drinking and other things. The people of India revere the Ganges River as a sacred source of life. However, the people of Kanpur are going through a water crisis due to water reductions, industrialization, the drying of the Ganges River, and a massive amount of pollution. Unfortunately, the water is receding, leaving dry hand pumps, and the Ganges River is also being heavily polluted, as I said before. Therefore, not only is there a water scarcity, but a water contamination. Both water sources are being depleted, resulting in the trucking of water to the residents. Many times, brawls ensue since the water supply fails to meet almost 30% of the demand. So here's a little slide about the Ganges. The Ganges is going to be a very important aspect of this speech, so I figured I'd put a little information about the Ganges in there. The Ganges River, also referred to as the Ganga in Hindu, is 1,560 miles long and is revered in India as one of the most sacred Hindu sites. Many times people who practice Hinduism will go and they'll bathe in the river, and actually one of the pitfalls is they actually kind of believe that God will heal the river by himself, so they don't think that they really need to put forth effort into healing it. But even though it is very polluted, they will still continue to bathe in it, to pray in it, and to have pilgrimages to the river because it's so holy and sacred. Many projects have been put into place to clean up the Ganges, but none have worked so far, and in fact the situation continues to worsen. Kanpur is the 9th largest city in India with 2.7 million residents and more than 300 tanneries, which is where they produce leather products, and they'll often export these products to the US and Europe. With more industrialization comes more pollution, especially since the industrialization of India is centered around the tanning industry. Kanpur's population is also steadily growing due to the increase in industrialization, meaning that it is becoming increasingly difficult to keep up with the demand on top of these already pre-existing issues. An increase in industrialization also means that more trash and things of that nature end up in the waterways. Obviously, we're an industrialized place, and our rivers don't look like that with all the trash. So I think another underlying cause of this is lack of education. I don't think they realize that all this trash, you throw one piece of trash and you're like, oh, that's fine, it's just a bottle cap, it's just a little piece of trash. But when everyone in India is doing this, and especially in Kanpur, you end up with these things. And everywhere you look along the Ganges, you'll find trash somewhere of some sort. As well as being one of the largest cities of India, Kanpur is also one of the most polluted. Tanneries dump unfiltered waste into the Ganges River, which eventually affects the groundwater as well. Toxins in this sludge of waste include arsenic, mercury, and the most worrisome, chromium. Its waste form is called hexavalent chromium. An excerpt from pureearth.org reads that hexavalent chromium is the most toxic form of chromium. Occupational studies have shown exposure to hexavalent chromium dust to be associated with lung cancer. Inhalation of hexavalent chromium has led to irritation of the respiratory system and gastrointestinal bleeding. Ingestion of hexavalent chromium may cause stomach upsets, ulcers, and severe damage to the kidneys and liver. A 1997 study conducted by the Central Pollution Control Board on the groundwater quality in Kanpur revealed that hexavalent chromium levels were 6.2 milligrams per liter. The Indian government places that restriction at 0.05 milligrams per liter. So that is like times and times greater than the limit is for drinking. And this chromium is in the groundwater because the recharging of the groundwater is the Ganges. So if you're polluting the Ganges and things like that, it's going to end up, to a certain extent, in the groundwater that they are drinking and ingesting. So this is a really powerful picture. This was taken by Arinda Mukherjee of untreated wastewater being drained directly into a canal in the Jajmo area of Kanpur. So here, you can't see it, it's black and white very well, but here's the unfiltered waste just being drained right into the canal. And there's a bunch of little canals that eventually lead into the Ganges. And that waste is completely unfiltered. So chromium, everything that they use to tan the hides of animals to then export is just being dumped straight into the river and then eventually consumed or bathed in or whatever. Besides chemical waste, about half of the residents of Kanpur don't have adequate plumbing. This means that their waste of all kinds, is dumped into the Ganges River. Luckily, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi launched the Clean India Mission, which plans to install toilets in every home and school by 2019. Unfortunately, I could not find any information on the success of this program, but all I found was that the situation continues to worsen. I also found, unfortunately, kind of like hurt my heart, was that other prime ministers do this as well, and they actually say they feel that they're called by God to clean up the Ganges, but if you don't have India on board with you, if you don't have other people seeing the problem, being educated on the problem, it's not going to be solved. So now I'm going to read you guys a small excerpt from an account on BBC News. Author Justin Rolat visited Kanpur and was shown the waterway by a campaigner he met named Rakesh Jaiswal. Jaiswal turns to me to speak. I see he has a handkerchief clamped over his nose and is gesturing towards the dark black water. I don't hear a word he says. I am totally overwhelmed, disabled by the warm, oily stench coming from the water. The smell is impossible to describe. There's human waste in there, and something very rotten indeed. But that's just what a wine buff would call the top notes. Behind them are other awful odors I can't even begin to identify. Meaty, acidic, and very wrong. Due to the previously mentioned causes of water shortage, many Indian residents rely on monsoon seasons to bring them their water supply. This doesn't last long because the methods for storing this necessary water is inefficient. On top of that, this water is also contaminated to a certain extent. The recharging of water is also ineffective and contaminated, making drinking water unsafe. Another way in which water is mismanaged is that farmers are able to build wells in a matter of days, and then there is no restriction to how much water they can pull up to irrigate their fields. This leaves other cities, the hand pumps in cities like Kanpur, so Kanpur is heavily industrialized, they don't have as many farmlands. Some cities in India are completely, devoted to farmland. So if you're building wells and you're pulling out all this water, the water tables are receding, leaving hand pumps totally dry, because they no longer reach into the water table. So here's kind of a picture of the Ganges. You can see the sand beds, and it dries up during the dry seasons, which isn't good. Even though they have monsoon seasons, it's not really enough to keep up. Here's, it's really fuzzy, but it's still a really good depiction of the water availability per capita in India. It starts at 1947, and the dotted line, which starts here, is the prediction for the water availability. So it looks like this was done in 2007 because that's when the actual line stops. But it's still very powerful to see how fast it declines. So yeah, I just thought that was really interesting and really powerful. The effects of the water crisis in Kanpur are lack of available water for drinking and other uses, birth defects from contaminated water, toxic farming soil from the chemicals released into the water from tanneries, increase in the ingestion and encounter with toxic chemicals, and possibly even eventually death. So here's a picture of some of the birth defects. This guy's literally has his head under the nasty water. That just speaks to me saying that they don't realize it's a problem. This is all they've been shown, this is all they've ever had, so they don't see it as dirty, they see it as normal water. And then that's just a powerful picture of, they might not be drinking exactly that, but the contents chemically and all that of the water is not good. So some possible solutions are to request that every resident put effort into cleaning the Ganges River, and I think with that comes educating every resident on what clean water looks like, and the fact that these birth defects and things that they're dealing with come directly hand in hand with the gross water that they have. Implement fines and create laws against polluting the river / dumping waste in certain areas, and then actually enforcing them. So they do have obviously laws against polluting, but they don't enforce them. They, continue to do what they do, and if they're doing something bad, at most they'll say, oh, I recommend that this place is shut down, or I'll recommend that we do this, but nothing's ever actually done. No one's ever, put in jail, or no one's ever fined for polluting waterways or doing anything like that. Regulating the tanning industry and how they dispose of their waste. Farmers using a better ways of irrigation for their lands. Implementing adequate plumbing in every home and following through with plans and programs put in place. So if we want to solve the water crisis in Kanpur, India, I think a total overhaul is needed. Not enough people look at this situation as a crisis, but I think that if we saw it for what it is, then people would be working a lot harder to clean up the river and reduce pollution. Not only do we need to clean up, but the underlying causes of this water crisis, as mentioned in this presentation, need to be addressed and solved for good.